The last 12 ships of the Zelvari people drifted through the endless darkness of space, like wounded animals searching for a place to die. Their engines sputtered and failed every few hours. Their life support systems groaned under the strain of keeping 200,000 souls alive, and their food supplies had run out 3 days ago. Ambassador Yelantar stood on the bridge of the lead vessel, her four-fingered hands gripping the console so tightly that her knuckles had turned pale, and she stared at the blue planet growing larger in the viewscreen with a mixture of desperate hope and crushing dread. This was Earth, a world so primitive and insignificant that the Galactic Council had not even bothered to assign it a registration number in their official records. The humans who lived there had only recently learned to travel beyond their own moon, and their technology was considered laughably outdated by galactic standards. But Earth was the last hope for the Zelvari people, and Yelantar knew that if these primitive creatures turned them away like everyone else had, her species would simply cease to exist. Behind her, Captain Torvik approached with heavy footsteps, his once-proud posture now bent under the weight of 11 years of running and loss and despair. "Ambassador," he said in a voice that cracked with exhaustion, "we have perhaps 2 days of life support remaining, maybe 3 if we reduce power to non-essential sections. The children are growing weak from hunger, and we lost another elder this morning." Yelantar closed her large silver eyes and tried to push away the memories that threatened to overwhelm her. She remembered the day the hegemony of Rax had descended upon their beautiful homeworld of Velanthos, their massive warships blocking out the sun and casting shadows across cities that had stood for 10,000 years. The Rax were collectors of species, harvesters of sentient beings who viewed other races as nothing more than resources to be exploited and consumed. They had decided that the Zelvari, with their natural grace and intelligence and gentle spirits, would make excellent additions to their empire of slaves. Her people had tried to fight back at first, but the hegemony commanded thousands of warships crewed by soldiers who had conquered 100 worlds, while the Zelvari had been a peaceful civilization of scientists and artists and philosophers who had never needed weapons or warriors. The war lasted only 6 days before it became clear that resistance was futile. When the harvesting began, when the hegemony started rounding up Zelvari by the millions and shipping them off to labor camps across the galaxy, the survivors made a desperate choice. They gathered everyone they could find and fled in whatever ships could still fly, leaving behind their homes and their history and 9 billion of their people. 200,000 souls had escaped that day, and for 11 years they had wandered the stars, begging for sanctuary from any civilization that would listen to their pleas. The Corvith Collective had been their first attempt at finding refuge, and Yelantar still remembered standing before their council of elders with tears streaming down her face as she described the horrors her people had witnessed. She had shown them recordings of the harvesting camps, of children being torn from their mothers, of elders being executed because they were too old to work. The Corvith had listened politely for 2 hours, their expressions never changing from cold indifference, before informing her that accepting refugees would strain their resource allocation systems beyond acceptable parameters. Request denied. The Thessian Imperium had been even worse, refusing to allow the refugee fleet anywhere near their territory and opening fire when the Zelvari ships crossed their border in desperation. 3,000 people had died that day, including families with young children who had survived 11 years of running only to be killed by a species too afraid of complications to show basic mercy. The Galactic Council itself, that great assembly that claimed to uphold justice and peace and the rights of all sentient beings, had labeled the Zelvari as unregistered migrants and frozen their beacon requests so that their cries for help vanished into the void unheard. 7 civilizations the Zelvari had approached over 11 long years, and 7 times they had been turned away with excuses that ranged from economic concerns to biosecurity protocols, to simple cold-hearted indifference. Now they had come to Earth, to a primitive world of beings who had never met another species, and Yelantar felt the weight of 200,000 lives pressing down upon her shoulders like a mountain. "Open a channel," she ordered, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the fear churning in her stomach, "and transmit our distress signal on all frequencies. Let us see if these humans are any different from the rest." The communication officer nodded and activated the transmission array, and within moments, their desperate plea was broadcasting into the void. Yelantar waited in silence, expecting to hear nothing or perhaps the whine of weapons powering up to destroy them. What came instead, just 47 minutes later, was a voice that would change the course of history. "Unidentified vessels, this is Earth United Defense Command speaking. We are receiving your distress signal and wish to understand your situation. Please confirm. Do you require assistance?" The bridge fell absolutely silent as every Zelvari present turned to stare at the communication console in stunned disbelief. In 11 years of running across the galaxy, in 7 attempts to find sanctuary among civilizations far more advanced than this primitive world, no one had ever simply asked if they needed help. Yelantar found her voice trembling as she activated the response channel. "Earth vessel, this is Ambassador Yelantar of the Zelvari refugee fleet. We are survivors of a genocide that destroyed our homeworld. We carry 200,000 souls, including many children and elders, who have nowhere else in this universe to go. We are asking you, we are begging you with everything we have for sanctuary." There was a pause that stretched into eternity, and Yelantar braced herself for the rejection she was certain would come. Instead, the human voice returned with words that would echo through history and change everything the Zelvari thought they knew about the universe. "Ambassador Yelantar, please hold your current position and do not be alarmed by approaching vessels. We are dispatching medical ships and supply transports to your coordinates immediately. Earth welcomes you." Yelantar could not speak, could not move, could not do anything except stand frozen as those final 3 words washed over her like warm water. "Earth welcomes you." Behind her, Captain Torvik made a sound that was half laugh and half sob, and she heard other crew members beginning to weep openly. "Did they really just say yes?" someone whispered in a voice filled with wonder. Within 6 hours, small human vessels began arriving at the refugee fleet, and what happened next shattered every assumption the Zelvari had ever made about how the universe worked. Human doctors wearing protective suits boarded the dying ships not with weapons or demands, but with medical supplies and food and blankets, and gentle words of comfort. Yelantar watched in amazement as a human woman with kind eyes knelt beside a dying Zelvari child and began working frantically to save his life, even though she had never seen his species before and had no idea what his biology required. The woman looked up at Yelantar with fierce determination burning in her strange round eyes. "Tell me what he needs," she demanded, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Tell me everything about his biology and I will find a way to help him. I am not letting this child die." They worked through the night and into the next day, humans and Zelvari laboring side by side, and by the time the sun rose over Earth the child was stable, and 17 other critical patients had been pulled back from the edge of death. 3 days later, the United Nations of Earth convened an emergency session that was broadcast to every nation on the planet. Yelantar was invited to speak before the assembled leaders of humanity, and she stood at the podium with her translator struggling to keep up as she described the destruction of her world and the long years of rejection and suffering that followed. When she finished, there was silence in the great chamber, and then a delegate from a country called Kenya rose to his feet and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the room. "These people came to us with nothing except hope, and we have the power to give them everything they need. I move that Earth grant full and permanent asylum to the Zelvari people, effective immediately. The vote took less than 1 hour to complete. 193 nations voted yes. 4 voted no. Earth had done what no other civilization in the entire galaxy had been willing to do. Earth had said yes. As the results flashed across the screens, Yelendar collapsed into her chair and wept for the first time in 11 years, and these were not the tears of grief she had grown so accustomed to shedding. These were tears of hope. A young human aide named Sarah knelt beside her and took her hand gently. "You are safe now," Sarah said with absolute certainty in her voice. "You are home." The Zelvari had come to Earth expecting to beg for scraps of mercy from primitives who knew nothing of the galaxy. Instead, they had found something they had stopped believing existed. They had found family. 3 years had passed since the day Earth opened its arms to the Zelvari refugees, and Ambassador Yelendar still found herself amazed every single day by what humanity had accomplished in such a remarkably short time. She stood on the balcony of her residence in New Velar, the settlement that humans had built specifically for her people in the northern regions of a vast, sunburned land they called Australia, and she watched the city below her come alive with the sounds of mourning. The name New Velar had been chosen by a human child during a naming contest that the government had organized to help the Zelvari feel connected to their new home. A 7-year-old girl named Emma had learned about the Zelvari homeworld Velanthos in school and decided that the refugees deserved something that would remind them of the world they had lost while also representing the new beginning they had found. When Yelendar first heard the name announced, she had wept so hard that she could not speak for nearly an hour. Below her balcony, the settlement stretched out in graceful curves and soaring towers that blended traditional Zelvari architectural principles with human engineering innovation in ways that took her breath away every time she looked upon them. The humans had not simply constructed temporary shelters and told the refugees to be grateful for what they received. They had asked the Zelvari elders what they needed, what they wanted, what would make them feel truly at home in this strange new world. Teams of human architects had spent months studying ancient Zelvari design texts that had been preserved in the refugee ships, learning how her people preferred high vaulted ceilings that allowed them to stretch their elongated frames to full height, and how they needed humidity-controlled environments to protect their sensitive blue skin from drying out in Earth's atmosphere. The humans had even installed artificial twilight systems throughout the entire settlement that mimicked the soft purple glow of Velanthos and its twin moons, a detail so incredibly thoughtful that many Zelvari elders had simply stood beneath the lights and wept when they first experienced them. But it was not just the buildings and the technology that amazed Yelendar as she looked out over the city. It was the effort, the care, the genuine and heartfelt desire to understand her people and make them feel welcome. Human linguists from universities around the world had worked tirelessly to learn the Zelvari language, studying recordings and texts, and spending countless hours in conversation with refugees who were happy to teach them. Now there were thousands of humans who could speak Zelvari fluently, and millions more who had learned basic phrases so they could greet their new neighbors properly and make small talk in the markets. Human farmers and botanists had pored over Zelvari agricultural databases and somehow managed to grow several species of plants from their destroyed homeworld using seeds that had been preserved in emergency storage aboard the refugee ships. The first time Yelendar had tasted Vila fruit again, a sweet purple fruit she had not eaten since the day her world burned, she had to sit down on the ground because her legs simply refused to hold her weight any longer. A knock at her door interrupted her morning reflections, and she turned to find David Okonkwo standing in the doorway with his usual warm and welcoming smile. David was the human diplomat assigned to New Velar as a permanent liaison, a tall man with dark skin and eyes that sparkled with kindness whenever he laughed, and he had become something like a brother to Yellontar over the past 3 years. They had spent countless hours together discussing philosophy and history and the nature of compassion, and Yellontar had come to treasure his friendship more than almost anything else in her new life. "The children are asking for you," David said with a grin. "They want you to come see what they have built in the garden. Apparently it is very important." Yellontar followed him through the winding streets of New Velar, past homes where Zelvari families were preparing morning meals and gardens, where elders sat in the artificial twilight telling ancient stories to eager young listeners. Everywhere she looked, she saw her people living again, not merely surviving from one day to the next but genuinely and truly living. They reached the central garden, a vast green space filled with both earth plants and Zelvari flora, where the community gathered for celebrations and festivals, and there Yellontar found a sight that stopped her completely in her tracks. A group of perhaps 30 children were playing together on the soft grass, laughing and shouting and tumbling over each other with the pure unrestrained joy that only children can produce. Half of them were Zelvari with their blue skin and silver eyes and elongated limbs, and half were human children with their round faces and colorful hair and compact bodies. A human girl with bright red hair tied in 2 braids was attempting to teach a young Zelvari boy named Torek how to kick a round black and white ball that she called a soccer ball. Torek was absolutely terrible at it because his legs bent differently than human legs, and his sense of balance was calibrated for a world with lower gravity. And every time he tried to kick the ball, it went spinning wildly in some unexpected direction. But neither of them seemed to care, even slightly, about his lack of skill. They were laughing so hard that tears were streaming down both their faces. The human girl and the alien boy united by the simple universal joy of playing together and being young and alive. Yellontar watched as Torek finally managed to make solid contact with the ball, sending it flying sideways where it knocked over a carefully stacked tower of toys and made everyone in the garden dissolve into hysterical laughter. "You are definitely getting better," the human girl shouted encouragingly while trying to catch her breath. "I am absolutely not getting better," Torek replied through his own laughter, his facial plates shifting in the way that only happened when Zelvari experienced pure, unfiltered happiness. "I am the worst soccer player on this entire planet." "That is okay," another human boy called out. "I am terrible at that jumping game you taught us yesterday, so we are even." David came to stand beside Yellontar, and for a long, peaceful moment, they simply watched the children play without saying anything. "Do you know what I love most about children?" David finally said in a quiet voice. "They do not see differences the way adults do. They do not look at Torek and see an alien refugee from another world. They just see a friend who is really bad at soccer." Yellontar nodded, unable to speak past the tightness that had formed in her throat. Just 3 years ago, those Zelvari children had been starving on dying ships in the void between stars, knowing nothing of life except fear and loss, and the constant, exhausting terror of running from predators who wanted to enslave them. Now they were playing soccer with human friends in a garden filled with flowers from 2 different worlds, laughing like children were supposed to laugh and living like children deserved to live. "David," she finally managed to say, her voice rough with emotion, "why did your people do all of this for us? You did not have to build us a beautiful city. You did not have to learn our language or grow our food or create artificial twilight to remind us of home. You could have simply given us a place to sleep and called it sufficient charity." David turned to look at her with an expression she had come to recognize as genuine confusion mixed with something like wounded offense at the suggestion. "That would never have been sufficient," he said firmly. "You are not guests visiting for a short time, Yellontar. Guests come and go and eventually leave. You are our neighbors now. And neighbors deserve a real home, where they can build real lives. But the cost must be enormous, she pressed. The resources, the time, the effort of millions of humans working to make strangers comfortable. What do you expect from us in return for all of this generosity? David smiled and shook his head slowly. Nothing at all. Nothing. You needed help, and we had the ability to provide that help. That is all the justification we ever needed or wanted. Yelentar thought about the Corvith and their cold calculations about resource allocation, about the Thessians who had murdered 3,000 refugees rather than risk complications, about all the advanced and ancient civilizations that had turned her people away with bureaucratic excuses and indifferent cruelty. None of those species had been unable to help the Zelvari. They had simply been unwilling to make the effort. And here was humanity, a species so young that they had barely learned to travel among the stars, giving absolutely everything they had to strangers from another world for no reason, except that those strangers had needed help. Your species is very strange, Yelentar said softly. David laughed, and it was a warm, rich sound that she had grown to love over their years of friendship. We have been told that many times before by many different people, he admitted cheerfully, but I prefer to think of us as stubborn rather than strange. Once we decide that someone belongs with us, we simply do not let go no matter what. A commotion from the garden drew their attention, as the children came running toward them in a chaotic, happy mob. Ambassador Yelentar, young Torek shouted excitedly. Lily says there is something called ice cream that is apparently the greatest food in the entire universe, and we absolutely have to try it right now. The human girl, Lily, nodded vigorously, her red braids bouncing with enthusiasm. My mother makes the best chocolate ice cream in all of Australia and possibly the whole world, and I told Torek he cannot truly be an official member of our friend group until he has tried it at least once. Yelentar looked down at these beautiful children, at the easy natural friendship between species that the rest of the galaxy would have considered impossible, and she felt warmth spreading through her chest like sunlight. Then we absolutely must try this legendary ice cream immediately, she declared with exaggerated seriousness, for I too wish to be an official member of your friend group. The children cheered and grabbed her hands and began pulling her toward Lily's family home, with an enthusiasm that would accept no resistance. As she let herself be joyfully dragged along, Yelentar caught David's eye and saw him smiling with that warm, gentle expression that made everything feel safe. This was what home truly meant, she realized with sudden clarity. Not just buildings and food and artificial twilight that reminded you of what you had lost. Home was being wanted by people who chose you. Home was belonging somewhere with people who cared. Home was children laughing together and friends smiling at each other, and communities that learned your language and grew your food and built you a city simply because they wanted you to be happy and whole. For 11 years, the Zelvari had searched desperately across the galaxy for mere safety. On Earth, they had found something infinitely more precious and rare. They had found a family that would never let them go. The transmission arrived on a cold, gray morning in January, 5 years after the Zelvari refugees had first come to Earth seeking sanctuary, and it changed absolutely everything in ways that no one could have predicted. Ambassador Yelentar was in New York City attending a cultural exchange conference where human and Zelvari artists were sharing their creative traditions, when she received an urgent summons to the United Nations headquarters, just a few blocks away. She knew immediately that something was terribly wrong from the tone of the messenger's voice, and the fear barely hidden behind his professional composure. When she arrived at the Great Assembly Hall, she found it filled with grim-faced diplomats and military officials from every nation on Earth, their expressions ranging from shock to fury to something that looked almost like anticipation. At the center of the vast room, A massive holographic display showed the official seal of the Galactic Council, that ancient organization that claimed to govern civilized space and maintain peace among the stars. Secretary General Amara Diallo stood at the main podium, her dark eyes hard as polished stone, and her hands gripped tightly at her sides as she addressed the gathered representatives of humanity. 2 hours ago, she began, her voice tight with barely controlled anger, we received the following transmission from the Galactic Council. I want every person in this room and every citizen watching this broadcast to hear exactly what was said to us. The holographic display flickered and shifted to show the face of a Corvith official, one of the same species that had rejected the Zelvari refugees all those years ago with cold words about resource allocation concerns. His thin face showed no emotion whatsoever as he delivered the ultimatum in a flat monotone voice. The planet designated Earth is currently harboring unregistered refugees who are legally classified as property belonging to the hegemony of Rax, according to Section 447 of the Galactic Commerce Code. You have one standard galactic cycle, which translates to approximately 30 of your local planetary days, to gather and surrender the entire Zelvari population to hegemony representatives who will arrive to collect them. The Corvith official paused, and when he continued his tone carried the absolute certainty of someone who had never been refused anything in his entire life. Failure to comply with this lawful demand will result in the immediate and permanent nullification of your planet's protection status under galactic law. Once this protection is removed, the hegemony of Rax will be fully authorized to collect their property by any means they deem necessary, including the use of military force. This is not a negotiation. This is a notification of legal requirements. You have 30 days. The transmission ended abruptly, and a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the assembly hall like a shroud. Yelintar felt the world spinning around her as the words sank into her mind and wrapped around her heart like cold metal chains. Property. The Galactic Council had officially declared her people to be property, objects to be collected and owned rather than living beings with rights and dignity. 200,000 souls who had fled genocide and wandered, lost for 11 years, and finally found hope and home on this beautiful blue world. 200,000 people who had built new lives and formed friendships and started families, and learned to laugh again after so much suffering. And now the galaxy wanted to drag them back into slavery, as if the past 5 years had meant nothing at all. She looked around the room at the faces of the human leaders, fully expecting to see the same weary resignation she had witnessed in 7 other civilizations, when faced with demands from powers greater than themselves. Every other species had eventually decided that helping the Zelvari was simply not worth the cost and the risk. Instead of resignation, Yelintar saw something that made both her hearts begin to beat faster with sudden desperate hope. She saw Ray. Pure blazing righteous fury burned in the eyes of every human in that room, from the diplomats in their formal suits to the military officers in their decorated uniforms. Secretary General Diallo's hands were trembling visibly, not with fear but with barely contained anger that seemed to radiate from her like heat from a fire. They have called our people property, she said in a quiet voice that somehow carried to every corner of the vast hall. They expect us to hand over 200,000 innocent lives to slavers and murderers, simply because those slavers have more ships and bigger weapons. She looked out over the assembly, her gaze moving slowly from face to face. The Galactic Council believes that because we are young and small and technologically primitive by their standards, we will simply do as we are told like obedient children. They believe that we will sacrifice 200,000 lives to protect ourselves from consequences. Her voice rose steadily with every word she spoke. They believe that humanity will choose the easy path, the safe path, the path of cowardice and collaboration with monstrous evil. She slammed her palm down on the podium, with a crack that echoed through the silent chamber. "They are catastrophically wrong about who we are." The assembly erupted in shouts of agreement and support, and Yellentar found herself being gently, but insistently pushed toward the podium by the delegates around her. Secretary General Diallo reached out and took her hand firmly. "Ambassador Yellentar," she said, "I want you to tell them everything. Tell them what the hegemony did to your world and your people. Let them understand exactly what they are asking us to surrender you to." Yellentar's throat constricted as memories she had spent years trying to bury came flooding back with overwhelming force. But she found her voice somewhere in the depths of her grief and determination, and she told them everything. She told them about the day the hegemony warships had descended upon Velanthos and blocked out the sun with their massive hulls. She told them about the harvesting camps where her people had been sorted like livestock, the young and strong separated for hard labor, while the old and sick were simply eliminated as inefficient. She told them about children torn screaming from their parents' arms and loaded onto transport ships bound for mining colonies where they would work until they died. She told them about the resistance fighters who had sacrificed their lives to hold the evacuation routes open, just long enough for the refugee ships to escape with their precious cargo of survivors. She told them about her own beloved sister Kellen, who had stayed behind to operate a communications array that guided the fleeing ships to safety, and who Yellentar had watched die on a viewscreen when the hegemony finally found her. When she finished speaking, there was not a dry eye in the entire assembly hall, and the silence was thick with grief and horror, and something else that Yellentar recognized with growing wonder. It was resolve. A delegate from a country called Japan rose slowly to her feet and spoke in a voice that shook with emotion, but did not waver. "I move that the United Nations formally and unanimously reject the Galactic Council's ultimatum in its entirety and declare that Earth will never surrender the Zelvari people under any circumstances whatsoever." A delegate from Brazil stood immediately. "Seconded with the full support of my nation and my people." The vote was called, and Yellentar watched with tears blurring her vision as representative after representative cast their decision without hesitation. The final count was announced in a voice that rang with pride. 202 nations in favor of complete rejection. 0 against. Humanity had chosen to face the full military might of a galactic empire rather than surrender people they had known for only 5 years. They had chosen war over compliance, honor over safety, principle over survival. Secretary General Diallo turned to face the holographic display that would broadcast her words to every corner of Earth and far beyond, into the listening void of space. To the Galactic Council and to the hegemony of Rax, the United Earth Government sends this formal response to your demands. She straightened her spine and lifted her chin with dignity and defiance. The Zelvari are not your property, and they never will be. They are not refugees or migrants or any other dehumanizing category you create to deny their fundamental worth. They are our neighbors, our friends, our brothers and sisters in every way that matters. Her voice grew harder and sharper with every word. They are citizens of Earth now, and Earth protects its own no matter the cost. She took a slow breath and continued in a tone of absolute certainty. You have threatened us with war if we do not comply with your monstrous demands. Very well then. If war is what you insist upon bringing to our doorstep, then war is exactly what you will receive. Her eyes blazed with the light of a species that had survived ice ages and plagues and world wars, and come out stronger every single time. But understand this clearly, hegemony of Rax. Understand this, Galactic Council. Understand this, every civilization that turned away innocent refugees and condemned them to suffering and death. Her voice dropped to something cold and dangerous and utterly unafraid. Humanity does not abandon its family. Humanity does not bow down to slavers and tyrants, and humanity does not know how to quit fighting for what is right. She smiled, and it was the smile of an apex predator that had just been foolishly threatened. Come to our world and try to take our people from us. Come and discover exactly what happens when you threaten the family of Earth. The transmission ended, and the assembly hall erupted into organized chaos as military officials immediately began discussing defense strategies. Through it all, Yelentar stood frozen in place, completely unable to process what she had just witnessed. David Okonkwo appeared at her side, with determination carved into every line of his face. "We need to return to New Velar immediately," he said firmly. "There is much work to be done and very little time to do it." "David," she whispered, "why would you do this when you could simply give us up and guarantee your own safety? The Council would leave Earth alone if you just surrendered us." David looked at her as if she had spoken words in a language he could not comprehend. "Give you up," he repeated with something like disbelief. "Yelentar, we spent 5 years building you a home and learning your language and watching our children become friends with your children. You are ours now." He shook his head firmly. "And we absolutely do not let anyone take what belongs to us." He took her hand and began leading her toward the exit. "Now come along. We have a war to prepare for and not a moment to waste." As they left the Great Hall together, Yelentar looked back at the gathered leaders of humanity and finally understood something profound. She was looking at a species that had decided, unanimously and without a moment of hesitation, that some things in this universe were worth dying for. She was looking at a species that truly understood what family meant. She was looking at humanity. And for the first time since the terrible warning had arrived, she felt not paralyzing fear but something that surprised her greatly. She felt genuine pity for the hegemony of Rax. They had absolutely no idea what they had just awakened. The hegemony of Rax sent 40 of their most powerful warships to collect their property from the defiant little world called Earth, a fleet so devastatingly powerful that it had conquered entire star systems and crushed ancient civilizations that had existed for thousands of years before humanity's ancestors had even learned to walk upright. Admiral Zerax of the hegemony stood on the gleaming bridge of his massive flagship and watched the small blue planet growing larger in his forward view screen, with nothing but contempt and mild irritation in his cold reptilian eyes. His intelligence officers had provided detailed reports on Earth's military capabilities, and the information had made him laugh out loud when he first reviewed it. The humans possessed perhaps 24 vessels that could generously be called combat-capable, most of them barely more than modified cargo ships with weapons bolted onto their hulls as an afterthought. Their military technology was estimated to be at least 3 centuries behind hegemony standards, primitive to the point of being almost quaint. This expedition would not be a battle in any meaningful sense of the word. This would be a simple collection operation, perhaps with a brief demonstration of overwhelming force to remind these primitives of their proper place in the galactic hierarchy. "Admiral," his sensor officer reported with a note of mild confusion in his voice, "we are detecting unusual activity throughout the outer regions of this star system. There appear to be thousands of small metallic objects scattered among the asteroid fields in patterns that seem almost deliberate." Zerax waved a dismissive hand, without bothering to look away from the view screen. "Mining equipment most likely, or perhaps debris from their clumsy attempts at space exploration. These primitives have apparently been scrambling desperately to prepare some kind of defense against us. It would be amusing if it were not so pathetically futile." He gestured sharply toward the planet ahead. "Proceed directly to Earth and prepare the collection shuttles. I want this operation completed within 48 hours so we can return to more important duties. There is no need to waste time on insects." The hegemony fleet moved forward through the darkness of space with the absolute confidence of predators who had never tasted defeat and could not even imagine the possibility. They did not notice the silent watchers hidden among the tumbling asteroids. Small human vessels with their power systems reduced to minimum output to avoid detection. They did not see the thousands of automated weapons platforms drifting in carefully calculated positions, disguised as worthless space debris. They did not understand that for the past 8 months, while they had been preparing a simple collection operation, humanity had been transforming their entire solar system into the most elaborate and deadly trap in their species' violent history. Admiral Chen Wei sat in the worn command chair of the UES Defiance, the flagship of Earth's hastily assembled defense fleet, and watched the enemy formation approach on her tactical display with calm, steady eyes that betrayed none of the fear she felt deep in her chest. Around her, the bridge crew worked in tense, focused silence, each of them acutely aware that the next few hours would determine whether their species and their adopted family would survive to see another sunrise. All units across all sectors report ready and standing by, her tactical officer announced in a carefully controlled voice. Operation Homestead is fully prepared and awaiting your command to execute. Chen Wei allowed herself a moment to think about the 200,000 Zelvari sheltering in bunkers far below Earth's surface. Families huddled together in the darkness waiting to learn if they would live or be dragged away to slavery. She thought about the children she had seen playing in New Velar during her last visit. Human kids and Zelvari kids laughing together without any awareness of the differences that the rest of the galaxy considered so important. She thought about her own daughter Mai, who had a Zelvari best friend named Sella, and how they had made her promise to keep Sella and her family safe no matter what happened. "Open a channel on all frequencies," she ordered, her voice steady and clear. "Broadcast directly to the hegemony fleet." When the communication officer nodded confirmation, she spoke words that would echo through history. "Hegemony vessels, this is Admiral Chen Wei of Earth United Defense. You are hereby ordered to reverse course and withdraw from our solar system immediately. This is your only warning." Admiral Zerax's scarred reptilian face appeared on her view screen, his expression twisted with amused condescension at her audacity. "Little human female," he said in a tone one might use to address a particularly stupid child. "I command 40 warships that have destroyed civilizations older than your entire species. You have perhaps 20 primitive vessels that would struggle to threaten a freight convoy. I strongly suggest you surrender immediately and hand over the property we have come to collect. If you cooperate fully, we may allow some of your people to survive as servants." Admiral Chen Wei smiled, and it was the smile of someone who knew something her enemy could not possibly understand. "You have traveled across the galaxy to enslave refugees who came to us begging for help," she said calmly. "You have destroyed countless worlds and exterminated species, beyond counting, and grown wealthy and powerful on the suffering of the innocent." She leaned forward in her chair, her eyes locked onto the alien admiral's gaze. "And you genuinely thought that Earth would be easy prey?" Her smile grew wider and sharper. "Welcome to humanity, Admiral Zerax. We sincerely hope you survive the experience." She cut the transmission with a sharp gesture and gave the order that would change the course of galactic history. "All units, execute Operation Homestead immediately." The silent void of space erupted into absolute chaos. Throughout the asteroid fields that the hegemony sensors had dismissed as mining debris, thousands of hidden weapons platforms activated simultaneously and launched their payloads toward the enemy fleet. Nuclear warheads blazed through the darkness like angry stars, their trajectories calculated by human mathematicians who had worked without sleep for months to ensure maximum destruction. The civilian cargo ships that had seemed like harmless debris scattered throughout the system, suddenly powered up their engines and dove directly at hegemony vessels in suicide attacks, their volunteer crews ejecting in escape pods moments before impact. From the shadows behind moons and in the darkness beyond planetary orbits, Earth's hidden military fleet emerged from concealment and opened fire with every weapon they possessed. Admiral Xerax watched in horrified disbelief as 3 of his warships simply vanished in nuclear fire before their crews could even begin to raise defensive shields. "What is happening?" he screamed at his officers. "Where did all of this come from? Our intelligence said they had nothing." But there was no time for explanations or analysis. The humans attacked with a ferocity and desperate courage that the hegemony had never encountered in all their centuries of conquest, a savage willingness to die that came from defending something more precious than their own lives. Every satellite orbiting Earth had been secretly converted into a weapons platform, and they rained coordinated fire down upon any enemy ship that approached the planet. The space stations that humans had built for scientific research and manufacturing had been armed with massive missile batteries that filled the surrounding void with thousands of deadly projectiles. Civilian transport vessels crewed entirely by volunteers who knew they would probably die charged directly at hegemony warships, drawing enemy fire and allowing the military ships to strike from unexpected angles. Admiral Chen Wei commanded the desperate battle with cold precision, her voice steady and calm as she directed her forces in a deadly dance of destruction and sacrifice. "Wolf Squadron, concentrate all fire on the enemy flagship's engine section. Dragon Flight, provide cover for the evacuation shuttles moving civilians to the deep bunkers. All remaining missile platforms, focus everything on Sector 7, and do not stop firing until your magazines are empty." For 11 brutal hours, the battle raged across the solar system, and humanity paid a terrible and heartbreaking price for every inch of space they managed to hold. The UES Valor was the first human ship to fall, her hull torn open by hegemony weapons that should have been far beyond Earth's ability to resist. Her captain ordered his surviving crew to abandon ship before he piloted the crippled vessel directly into the side of a hegemony destroyer at full acceleration. The UES Hope died, protecting a civilian transport filled with Zelvari children being evacuated to deeper shelters, her crew choosing certain death over the possibility of allowing the enemy anywhere near the innocent lives they had sworn to protect. The UES Defiant, the UES Courage, the UES Remember Valanthos, ship after ship crewed by humans who had known the Zelvari for only 5 years gave everything they had and everything they were. 17 human warships were destroyed in that terrible battle. Over 40,000 soldiers made the ultimate sacrifice so that others could live. But when the silence finally came and the fires died, and the debris began its long, slow drift through the endless void, not a single hegemony vessel remained capable of threatening Earth. Admiral Xerax's once mighty flagship floated dead and powerless in space, its weapons silenced forever, and its surviving crew desperately broadcasting distress signals that no one would ever answer. Admiral Chen Wei looked at the wreckage scattered across her view screen and felt no sense of triumph or celebration, only bone-deep exhaustion and profound grief for all the brave souls who had given their lives. But beneath the grief, she felt something else as well. Pride. Earth had faced the full military might of a galactic empire that had never known defeat, and Earth had refused to break. In New Velar, far below the battle that raged in the heavens above, the Zelvari had gathered in underground shelters to watch the conflict unfold on display screens that showed them everything. Yelantar stood among her people with tears streaming endlessly down her blue face as she watched the human ships die one after another, each loss a sacrifice made willingly for people they had adopted as family only 5 years before. When the last hegemony vessel went dark and the human announcer's voice declared victory in tones of exhausted relief. The Zelvari did not cheer or celebrate. They wept. They wept for the humans, who had given absolutely everything to protect them from slavery. They wept for the 40,000 soldiers, who would never return home to their families. They wept because they finally understood with perfect clarity what it truly meant to be loved by humanity. An elderly Zelvari named Torvik, the same captain who had commanded the Refuge fleet on its desperate journey to Earth so many years ago, fell to his knees on the cold shelter floor and pressed his forehead to the ground in the deepest gesture of respect his culture knew. "They died for us," he whispered through his tears. "Complete strangers died for us." Yelentar knelt beside him and placed a gentle hand on his trembling shoulder. "We are not strangers to them anymore," she said softly, her voice breaking. "We have not been strangers for a very long time. We are family now." She looked up toward the ceiling, toward the stars beyond where the debris of sacrifice still drifted, and she made a silent, solemn promise to every human who had given their life that day. "Your sacrifice will never be forgotten as long as a single Zelvari still draws breath. Your courage will be sung about for 1,000 generations. And we will spend the rest of our existence proving ourselves worthy of the love that humanity showed us. Because that is what family does for each other." 1 full year had passed since the battle that shook the foundations of galactic civilization, and Ambassador David Okonkwo now stood before the assembled representatives of the Galactic Council, preparing to deliver a message that would echo through history for generations to come. The council chamber was a vast and impossibly ancient space, its walls carved from stone that had been shaped by beings who had mastered interstellar travel, while humanity's ancestors were still learning to make fire. Delegates from 47 different species filled the tiered seating, watching the lone human representative with expressions that ranged from barely concealed terror to grudging and uncomfortable respect. These were the same civilizations that had turned away the Zelvari refugees with cold indifference, the same powers that had declared desperate survivors to be unregistered migrants unworthy of protection, the same voices that had given the hegemony of Rak's official permission to harvest an entire species into slavery. Now they sat in uncomfortable silence and watched a representative of a primitive backwater world that had somehow destroyed the most feared military force in the quadrant. David Okonkwo stood tall and calm at the speaker's platform, his dark eyes moving slowly across the sea of alien faces without showing the slightest hint of intimidation or uncertainty. Behind him, a massive holographic display showed Earth floating serenely in the void, small and blue, and somehow impossibly defiant against the endless darkness of space. The Corvith High Chancellor, leader of the species that had first rejected the Zelvari refugees so many years ago, spoke with a voice that strained to maintain its customary tone of superiority. "You requested this audience with the full council, human. We have granted your request despite the irregular circumstances. Speak whatever message you have come to deliver." David allowed a small smile to cross his face before he began. "I know what everyone in this chamber is truly wondering," he said in a voice that carried clearly to every corner of the vast room. "You want to understand why humanity did what we did, why we risked our entire civilization, our very existence as a species, for refugees we had never met before they appeared at our doorstep, why we chose almost certain destruction over simple compliance with your demands." He paused and let the silence stretch, watching the delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats. "You turned the Zelvari away because helping them was inconvenient for your economic projections," he said, looking directly at the Corvith delegation. "The Thessians refused them entry because they were afraid of potential complications with their border security protocols, and they murdered 3,000 innocent refugees to make their point absolutely clear." His gaze swept across the chamber. The Galactic Council itself, this august body that claims to uphold justice and protect the rights of all sentient beings, declared the survivors of a genocide to be unregistered migrants and silenced their desperate pleas so thoroughly that we almost never heard them at all. He stepped forward, and several delegates in the front rows instinctively leaned back from the intensity in his eyes. 7 civilizations the Zelvari approached over 11 years of desperate wandering, and 7 times they were rejected by species who had the power to help, but simply could not be bothered to make the effort. His voice hardened with each word. And then they came to Earth, and we said yes. A ripple of murmurs passed through the assembled delegates, quickly silenced as David continued speaking. We said yes because they needed help, and we had the ability to provide it. We said yes because turning away innocent people fleeing murder and enslavement was simply not something we were willing to do. We said yes because that is what decent beings do when they encounter suffering and have the power to ease it. He straightened his spine and lifted his chin. The Zelvari are human now. I do not mean that they have altered their biology or abandoned their culture or forgotten who they were before they found us. I mean that they are ours. We claimed them as family and they claimed us in return, and together we became something neither of us was before. His voice softened slightly as he spoke of what humanity had built. We constructed them a city designed around their needs and their traditions, with buildings that honored their architectural heritage and lighting that reminded them of the moons they would never see again. We learned their language so we could speak to them as neighbors rather than strangers. We grew plants from their destroyed homeworld so they could taste the foods they remembered from childhood. He smiled with genuine warmth. We watched our children become friends with their children, playing together in gardens and learning from each other, and building bonds that will last for generations. We attended their weddings and celebrated when their babies were born. We sat with their elders as they passed from this life and honored their dead alongside our own. The smile faded as his expression grew serious once more. And when you sent warships to take them from us, we did exactly what any family would do when threatened by outside forces. His voice rose until it filled every corner of the ancient chamber. We fought with everything we had. The word echoed off walls that had stood for millennia, and every delegate in the room felt the weight of human determination pressing down upon them. 40,000 of our people died in that battle, David continued, his voice thick with grief that he did not attempt to hide. 40,000 soldiers who will never see their families again, who will never grow old, who gave their lives so that strangers they had adopted as family could live free. His eyes glistened with unshed tears, but his voice remained strong and unwavering. Do you want to understand why they did it? Why they climbed into ships they knew were outgunned and flew into battle against an enemy that should have crushed them without effort? He looked around the chamber at the alien faces, watching him with expressions of confusion and growing unease. Because the Zelvari were ours. Because once you become part of our family, we will move mountains and drain oceans and fight gods themselves before we let anyone take you away. Because humanity has learned something that all your ancient and advanced civilizations seem to have completely forgotten over your long histories. He spoke the next words slowly and clearly, making absolutely certain that every delegate understood their meaning. Some things in this universe are worth dying for. The Thessian ambassador rose from her seat, her voice trembling with a mixture of wounded pride and barely concealed fear. You cannot expect the civilized galaxy to simply accept what you have done. You have upset the natural order of things. You have defied powers far greater than your primitive world has any right to challenge. David turned to face her directly, with an expression that showed no sign of backing down. Yes, we have defied your natural order, and we will do it again without hesitation every single time it becomes necessary. He addressed the entire assembly once more. Let this day serve as a message to every civilization in this galaxy. Let it reach every empire and every council and every power that believes they can prey upon the weak and vulnerable without consequence. His voice grew cold and sharp as steel. If you come for our people, we will fight you until our last breath. If you threaten our family, we will make you regret the day you learned that Earth existed. If you believe that humanity will ever bow down to slavers or tyrants or anyone who thinks that some lives matter less than others, you are making a catastrophic mistake. He smiled again, and it was the smile of a species that had looked into the abyss of extinction and simply refused to blink. We do not know how to quit, we do not know how to surrender, and we absolutely never abandon family under any circumstances. He turned as if to leave, then paused and looked back over his shoulder. One more thing before I go. Ambassador Yelentar of the Zelvari asked me to share a message of her own with this council. He nodded toward the holographic display, which flickered and shifted to show Yelentar standing in the central plaza of New Velar, surrounded by thousands of her people. Her voice was clear and strong, and filled with emotion, as she spoke directly to the watching galaxy. To every refugee scattered across the stars, to every species that has been rejected and abandoned, and told that you do not matter enough to save, we want you to know something vitally important. She spread her arms wide to encompass the beautiful, thriving city that humans had built for her people. There is a world called Earth, and the beings who live there are called humans, and they said yes when every other civilization in the galaxy said no. Her voice broke with overwhelming emotion. They built us a home when we had lost everything. They made us family when we were alone and afraid. They fought and died for us when anyone else would have simply handed us over to our enemies. Tears streamed freely down her blue face. If you are lost and alone and desperately searching for somewhere to belong, find Earth. Find the humans, because they will welcome you with open arms. They will never turn you away, and they will fight until their dying breath to keep you safe and free. She looked directly into the recording device, her silver eyes shining with love and gratitude. That is what humanity does. That is the very core of who and what they are, and we are proud beyond any words to call them our family forever. The hologram faded away, leaving David Okonkwo standing alone before the stunned, silent council. That is everything we came to say, he concluded simply. He walked out of the ancient chamber without looking back, and the assembled representatives of 47 galactic civilizations watched him go in complete and utter silence. They had sent an empire to crush a primitive world that dared to show compassion. They had learned instead that some things in this universe cannot be conquered by force. That some species refuse to understand the meaning of surrender. That some bonds of love and family are stronger than fear and death, and the combined might of an entire galaxy. Humanity had taught the universe a lesson it would never forget. And somewhere on a small blue world orbiting an ordinary yellow star, a family of 200,000 Zelvari and 8 billion humans looked up at the night sky together. They were home at last. They were family forever. And nothing in the entire universe would ever change that truth.